Question 4 provides us with the physical properties and information for an unknown compound and asks us to find the identity of this unknown compound. So the physical information that was provided was one, its molar mass, which was 150.26 grams per mole. Two was its elemental composition, which was 87.93% carbon and 12.07% hydrogen. And finally is a melting point of 145 degrees Celsius. The first step to finding the identity of this compound is to look at its elemental composition. Elemental composition is equal to the molar mass of an element multiplied by the amount of that element there is within our compound, all divided by the total molar mass of the compound. And so when we do this for carbon, since we have an elemental composition of 87.93%, we're going to set that equal to the molar mass of carbon, which is 12.009 grams per mole, multiplied by the amount of carbon we have, which is going to be set to X. And that's all going to be divided by the total molar mass of the molecule, which is 150.26 grams per mole. When doing this, we get that we have 11 carbons in our molecule, and we're doing the same for hydrogen with its molar mass. We get that we have 18 hydrogens within our molecule. Therefore, our formula is C11H18. And C11H18 has a ton of isomers, and the way we differentiate between which isomer is right and wrong, the isomer that has the melting point of 145 degrees has to be the correct one. And therefore, we can conclude that our isomer is in fact 2-methyladenine. Parts B and C ask us to give a primary and secondary source, and therefore we have to define a primary and secondary source before we do so. A primary source is just going to be a first-hand account of the information that is being presented or recorded, and it's usually found through study or experimentation, while a secondary source is just a source that utilizes a primary source. Now, for example, when Pfizer comes out and says its vaccine is 93% efficient, Pfizer did the studies to find that number, and therefore Pfizer would be the primary source. And when CTV or CBC tell you that the Pfizer vaccine is 93% effective, there would be a secondary source, and since they took that number from Pfizer and just presented it to us, the viewer. My first primary source is a study journal article, and it's titled "The Preparation and Reactivity of Two Substituted Derivatives of Adamantane." And as you can see, the information is highlighted. My second primary source is another journal article. And a cool thing about this journal article is from 1963, Czechoslovakia in 1963, which is no longer a country. So it's kind of cool that we're using a source from a country that no longer exists as a primary source. My first secondary source, as you can see, it is a secondary source because it lists the notes and references, and this is in the references. It references where it got the melting point information from. And my final secondary source is the same thing. You could see this little number 33 beside the 2-methyladamantane means that the 2-methyladamentene's information came from the list of references, and it's the 33rd reference on here. The final question asks us about the peer review process, and more specifically, creating a flowchart for how the peer review process works. And so when looking at it, the peer review process is going to start with a scientist collecting data. And now with that data, that scientist is going to write a manuscript based on the data he's collected. Now the next step is he's going to send it to a journal editor. The reason it's sent to a journal editor before it is peer reviewed is because the journal editor needs to decide if it's worth everyone's time and if it fits the criteria of the journal. And if it does fit the criteria, then it's passed on to the peer reviewers, and if not, it gets rejected right away. Now, let's say it does get passed on and it does pass the requirements. Once it gets to the peer reviewers, they also will provide their feedback. And based on their feedback, the manuscript is then either rejected for not meeting the criteria of the journal, or it passes all the evaluations and it is published. And that is the basic flowchart for how a peer review process works.